That's so brilliant! This video is sponsored by Case Filters. What I often see in my workshops is that especially beginners, but also advanced, tend to pay too much attention on deciding on their camera settings. And don't get me wrong here, it is so important to use the right camera settings. But this is something that should work automatically, without thinking all that much about it, so that we can focus more on the really important things like composition, light and storytelling, things like that. So in this video I'm going to show you an easy way of how to manage the camera settings, so that the camera settings itself will never be an issue anymore when you're out on location. And I also will give some pro tips as well to get better image quality, so get sure to watch this video to the end. Hi my friends, very nice to see you. It is really interesting. I often have photographers in my workshops who want to get better in landscape photography or fine art photography in general. And when I look at their photos, I can often see things they could improve from the artistry side. But when we're out on location then, in so many cases, we waste too much time with just the camera settings. And don't get me wrong here, I'm really happy when I can help, of course. I just think this is nothing really you should pay money for. In workshops you can get out so much more when you know already how to use a camera. So I would say, let's dive in. Now, the most important stylistic instrument on my camera is definitely the aperture. And this is why I want to decide on a specific aperture that allows me to get control over the depth of field, so that everything gets pin sharp from front to back. Or to get a little softness in the distance, whatever I want to achieve. According to the depth of field, the aperture is the tool to get there. I will not go in detail here how to choose the right aperture. I made already a comprehensive video about this topic and I will link it in the end of this video. However, I want to be that one who decides on a specific aperture. And this is why I don't use the auto mode on my camera. I usually use aperture priority, that's the A mode. A big tip for beginners, by the way: go out for photography 10 to 15 times maybe, or even longer, with using the manual mode on your camera, because this helps you to understand how the exposure triangle works. But for advanced and also masters, by the way, I would recommend the A mode, because we often photograph in situations when the amount of light is changing. So it is good to have an automation here that we can focus on composition, and instead of thinking of the camera settings and so. And with the A mode turned on, I decide on the aperture I want to use. And now, very important, what I do next is I use the exposure compensation to adjust the exposure. And therefore it is important to understand the histogram on our camera. Just quickly for beginners, on the right side we see the brighter pixels of our image up to white, and on the left side we see the darker pixels of our image down to black. When I see that the histogram is too much to the left, it is underexposed. In this case I simply increase the exposure by using exposure compensation. But when the histogram is too much at the right side instead, I decrease the exposure also by using the exposure compensation wheel. By the way, it is no problem at all when it goes to the right. We can correct it afterwards in post-processing. Exposing to the right leads even to less noise and better image quality, by the way. But the histogram should never ever touch the right or touch the left side. And one more tip is, cheaper cameras tend to have no exposure compensation wheel. So my Sony a7R4, for instance, has one, but my old and definitely cheaper a6000 didn't. But I can recommend, look into the manual of your camera. For my Sony a6000, I was able to configure my main wheel as an exposure compensation wheel. And this just when I was using the A mode. So that's really cool. You definitely don't need a more expensive camera. However, back to the topic. To this point we managed already to get a well-exposed image. But now we also should consider to get the right shutter speed for our image. And here are two different scenarios. If there are no moving elements in my frame, I don't have to care all that much about the shutter speed. Because I usually use a tripod, already just to fine-tune my composition out in the field, and also, slowing down my photography. It's really such a good tip, by the way. It helps you to think deeper into your composition. So basically, as I use a tripod, I have no problem at all to expose for multiple seconds even. But if there are some moving elements in my frame, such as moving water, moving foliage on trees, grasses in the foreground, or whatever it is, and I want to freeze that, I use the ISO to compensate for that. And that's quite simple. In the first step, I always try to use the base ISO of my camera. And for my Sony a7 IV, that's ISO 100 for instance. If you shouldn't know the base ISO of your camera, have a look in your manual. The base ISO leads to the best possible noise behavior of the sensor, and so to the best image quality. Now, when I want to get a faster shutter speed to freeze moving elements in the frame, I simply increase the ISO that much that the moving elements are not blurry anymore. How simple is that? And I will also give you a pro tip here, but before I will do that, my friends, if you like this video, please give me a thumb up. It helps me, it helps the algorithm, and it helps also other photographers out there to find this video better on YouTube. Thank you therefore. Well, increasing the ISO is a quite good tip to adjust the shutter speed when using the A mode. But let me give you a pro tip here. As increasing the ISO also leads to more noise, I often use a little trick here. When I see that I would need a higher ISO in the first step, I try to open the aperture a tiny bit more instead, just to get more light on the sensor to get a faster shutter speed. But it's just if it doesn't have a negative effect on my depth of field. And after that, when I still need a faster shutter speed, I increase the ISO. So all in all, we can say my ISO is as low as possible, but as high as necessary. But it could also be that we want to have a longer shutter speed instead to show motion in our image. Yeah, just think about water scenes for instance. And we have to be careful here. Modern cameras also allow us to decrease the ISO to something like ISO 64 or even 50. But to be honest, I usually don't use that all too much because it cuts the dynamic range of my sensor, and this would lead to worse image quality. Not always, it depends on the light, to be honest. When there is not much peak in the highlights, when the light is more flat, this could even lead to better image quality, but not much, so I really would not worry all too much about that, to be honest. What I do instead is I use a neutral density filter, an ND filter, to get longer exposure time. I use filters from Case. They are really super good, high image quality, totally reliable, fast to put on and off, to do a magnetic system. I will put you a link up here where I tell a bit more about what's important when I decide on filters, because there are many more criterions I consider when I decide on a filter. Well, now we have decided on the aperture, we have a well-exposed image, we also have considered the shutter speed as well, and the next thing we have to check is if the dynamic range of our camera is high enough for the scene we want to photograph. I simply want to avoid that there are parts that are just white in the lights or just black in the shadows. Sometimes I go intentionally quite far to white through to get the texture of my print a little bit shining through at particular parts in my image, but usually I want to have drawings in the shadows and drawings in the light. And therefore I check my histogram again. You remember, the darker pixels are on the left side, the brighter pixels are on the right side. I simply get sure that there is no clipping on both sides of my histogram. If there is a clipping and I can't compensate for that, by adjusting the exposure compensation, I have to increase the dynamic range of my camera. And to achieve that, we can either buy a more expensive camera, or we bracket the exposures. I'm just kidding, of course. Also with a more expensive camera, you will definitely come into situations where you have to bracket exposures. So there's nothing wrong with using a cheaper camera. By the way, leave me a comment below which camera you use, would really be interesting. Exposure bracketing, this simply means I make additional exposures for my photo. The easiest way therefore would be to take one shot normal exposed, one underexposed and one overexposed by 1 or 2 stops between, something like that, for instance. And then I can either blend them in Photoshop, or you can simply make an HDR in Lightroom. Most cameras of today support a bracketing function so that the camera takes already the different exposures automatically when you expose, that you don't have to do that manually. That's really cool. You just have to turn it on and to configure it in the way you need it. And by the way, there's also a way to bring that even to a master level, really to get the perfect exposure and the best possible image quality all the time. And I mentioned that already in one of my videos where I gave even 8 pro tips about photography. I will link the video up here, it's really a good one. And of course, there are lots of other settings modern cameras support, but to be honest, I would not worry all too much about that. It is better to be good at the basics and to focus on the really important things in photography, such as composition, light and storytelling. The most important setting is definitely the aperture. It is so important to be able to decide on the right aperture. Don't always just use f16 or so. Decide on the aperture that supports your composition, that supports your story. And if you shouldn't know how to do that, I made already a video about that and I will link it here for you. My friends, I hope you liked this video. If yes, give me a thumb up and thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to tune in next week. There will come a fantastic video as well. See you next time. Bye.